Hello and welcome to Book Reviews Kill, a podcast about fantasy, sci-fi, and horror novels. I'm Evan, and today I'm sitting down with Fonda Lee, author of Zeroboxer, the Exo Series, the Green Bone Saga, and a new novella called Untethered Sky. Fonda, thank you so much for your time and for sitting down with me today.
Thanks, Evan. Glad to be on the show.
Chad was supposed to be here today, but he's kind of sick, so it's just going to be Fonda and myself. And I haven't actually even heard from Chad this morning. He's that sick, so
No.
I'm gonna have a phone call from him later, a regretful phone call. But you snooze, you lose. I always like to start with this question, as we are a podcast primarily centered on books. We talk about video games sometimes, movies and stuff like that, but it's mostly books. So I wanted to know, what are you currently reading, if anything?
I almost always have two books on the go. I always have a print book going and an audiobook going. So right now, on the print side, I'm reading a classic historical fiction novel. It's Shogun by James Clavell, an oldie, but quite the huge epic. I'm making my way through that. It's a chonker for sure. I thought I wrote a chonker, but Clavell really wrote chonkers. So that's what I'm reading in print. And then on audio, I'm listening to Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. I always just enjoy listening to Gaiman narrate his own novels, and that was one of his that I hadn't read yet. So that's what I'm listening to.
It's funny. I've seen a lot of discourse that says authors should never narrate their own books. Stephen King's not a great narrator, and Daniel Handler, the person that did the Lemony Snicket books, after Tim Curry for some reason, trying to follow that up. But Neil Gaiman is one of the best narrators ever.
Right. He might be like the exception,
right,
to a sort of a general rule. And there are obviously authors who are professional narrators, like Mary Robinette Kowal and Travis Baldree, where I'm like, okay, you get you get a pass on this. Clearly you're qualified. I would never in a million years narrate my own audiobook. So I'm very impressed by people like Gaiman who can do that.
Do you think that you wouldn't want to do it because of the workload, or just because of the way that you think your voice sounds?
I just think that it would be weird to read my own book.
You've already read it so many times.
Yeah, exactly. I've already read it as much as I want to read it. And also, I don't think I could get the voices of my own characters.
Interesting.
It would bug me that I can do that. So I'll leave it to professionals.
Right, like how do you do Hilo consistently too?
Right, exactly.
You got to do it the same every time.
No.
So in your head,
yeah,
I had Travis Baldree on here months ago, and that was one of the questions was, how do you keep all these voices in line if you're doing a fantasy book with different creatures and races and all this stuff?
Yeah.
There's a whole file on his computer, apparently.
Yeah, I'm really happy. Fortunately, I've been very happy with all the audiobook narrators I've had. They always, so far, have done a great job. Andrew Kishino did such a good job with the Green Bone Saga. So yeah, I was very thrilled.
I did about half the Green Bone Saga with audiobook. And Andrew Kishino was incredible. Really, really good. Even sped up a little bit. And sometimes I find that the narrator, it's for some reason, if I speed it up, his cadence is weird. How did you find Andrew Kishino? Was that your choice, or was that the publisher's choice?
Well, the publisher sent me a few choices. So they narrowed it down to, I think, 3 auditions. And I was fortunate. They involved me. I said, I listen to a lot of audiobooks. I have strong opinions about them. And the narrator really makes it or breaks it for me. And so I gave them a page out of my book that had most of the main characters talking, because I wanted to see how each of the narrators would do them. And then I listened to, they actually had another narrator in mind. And then I listened to Andrew's audition, and I was like, oh yeah, no, that's Lon talking. That's Hilo talking. So it was a slam dunk for me. I'm really glad we got him. And he's a voice actor who's done a ton of, different shows and cartoons. And so, yeah, he knew how to do voices.
Would that have been Andrew's first time reading the Green Bone Saga, or did he have to read through it once and get a feel for it?
I don't know. I think you would have to ask him, but I believe his process is that, he reads through it and then he has to make notes around, how he's going to perform different parts before he sits down and records.
Especially with a series like the Green Bone Saga, which takes so many hard lefts emotionally. I feel like reading that out loud for the first time, you'd have to retake it sometimes because
Right.
some of those chapters are so abrupt and intense and they turn on a dime sometimes. And I think that trying to have like this measured, clear reading voice while trying to also read those for the first time would be kind of difficult. Another question I've got here is Untethered Sky is releasing soon. And for all our listeners, it is a monster hunting nature memoir that Chad and I both loved. We read it right when we got the book. It felt like a chapter taken from the story of a larger world. Do you have plans to write more stories about rocks and manticores and things like that? Or is this kind of a one off thing?
No, this is very much a one and done.
Cool.
And it's an interesting thing about, writing a story like Untethered Sky that's a novella, but that's like in a secondary fantasy world, that I still have to do all the work, like of building the world and coming up with the premise and the culture and the history of it and all that. But excerpting, the story that I want to tell, and everything in the background still has to like be created. So it's not actually like that much less work. Like even though it's a shorter book, right? I still have to do all the world building, but yeah, I wanted it to feel very much like as believable as gigantic birds of prey and man-eating monsters could be, given the nature of the story being that like wildlife memoir vibe. It's by itself.
It is such a fun book. I mean, the backdrop of Untethered Sky, I think, as much work as you did put into it, it's a very kind of subtle backdrop that I was able to draw a lot of different kind of like lines to different things in my own head. It was really great. In Untethered Sky's acknowledgments, you mentioned that you'd begun writing this story in 2015. You had discussed it with your agent, I believe, in
Yes.
2019.
Yeah. So I
Okay.
started writing it in 2015. And it at the time began as a novel. And then in 2019, I was writing Jade Legacy. So I set it aside because I was writing this gigantic trilogy.
Yeah.
And in 2019, I ended up having lunch with my future editor of the novella, Jonathan Strawn at Tor.com, who said, "Hey, have you ever thought about writing a novella? I know you're busy, finishing this trilogy, but what are you going to do afterwards?" And he kind of lured me in because he was like, novellas are short. I was like, they are. At this point, I mean, Jade Legacy is somewhere in the range of like 255,000 words,
God.
which for listeners is, 700 odd pages. So the idea of writing something short and contained was just deeply appealing. And that was actually the trip where I went on a hawk walk with my family. I was in Dublin for Worldcon and made a family vacation out of it. They flew over near the end of the con and we toured around Ireland. And I was always fascinated by birds of prey and by falconry. So we did this hawk walk, and I remembered, I was thinking about this novel that I had started years ago, but that I had set aside. And so like the stars aligned, and I was like, I'm going to come back to this project. And I got inspired to do so. So it's sort of a lesson to all of you writers who are listening. Sometimes the path for a project is a very long and convoluted one, and you may have a fantastic idea right now and you can't get to it, but it might go into cold storage and then come back out and you'll see it with fresh eyes, which is very much what happened to me. By the time I got around to working on Untethered Sky again, I had many more books under my belt. I had, a different set of tools as a writer, more experience, and looked at it and thought, I actually can make this. It was kind of as a novel, it wasn't quite working. It was sort of meandering. I wasn't really sure where I was going with it. And then when I thought about it as a novella, like things fell into place.
That's really interesting that it started as something much longer and then you decided, maybe upon reopening it, all that, and looking at it with fresh eyes, maybe this could be a little bit shorter and a little punchier, and I don't need all this other stuff. How did it feel opening it back up after finishing something so long and so involved and complicated? Was it really refreshing for you to kind of look at this story and say, all right, I'm gonna tell this up and down kind of like arc here and just tell this story. It's contained. Did it feel like kind of a break almost?
It really did. It felt like a very needed change of pace for me, because I was basically exercising very different muscles
Mm.
as a writer, right? Green Bone Saga is this vast story. It's a large canvas. It's dozens of characters. It's got a very modern, urban, gritty tone. And this was like the opposite of it in so many ways. It's short, it's focused, it's more contemplative and delicate. It's about the relationship of this one woman and this creature that she's training. It takes place in the pre-modern era, wide open countryside. It's so different from the Green Bone Saga that honestly I was having fun, but I was also kind of worried if any of my Green Bone Saga readers would read this because sometimes they really like your work for one thing, and there's definitely part of me that was like, maybe everyone's gonna who like Green Bone Saga is gonna hate this. But I was having fun, and from what I've heard so far, a lot of other people have enjoyed it, and so I think it is really important as a writer to make sure that like you are stretching yourself in different directions to keep it interesting for you as well as for your readers.
Speaking of writing, do you keep to a writing schedule, or do you have a specific routine you've found works for you when you're drafting or revising or rewriting?
I try to have a schedule. I would say I am medium successful at it. And it really kind of depends on where I am in the process. So writing is my job, and I treat it like my job, and I'll set aside, I'm going to work from this time of the day to this other time of the day. And I usually have specific goals that I'm trying to achieve in the short term. So I might get up on a Monday morning and be like, okay, this week my goal is to revise these 3 chapters, or it's to draft 10,000 words. It might be a week where I'm teaching or I'm traveling or I'm promoting my book. And so that all kind of factors into what my schedule looks like for any given week. But I have to work backwards oftentimes from deadlines. I'll know that I have a draft that's due by some certain date. And then I back into it and figure out, okay, that means that ideally I should have it drafted by this date, which means that I have to kind of work at this pace, and I know I'm going to lose 3 weeks because I have a book launch in between here. So I try to create a schedule, and then occasionally wrenches get thrown into it.
What do you find works for you when you're having difficulty with a scene, or you're in this drafting space and you've got a deadline? There's this plot point in a project that you're working on that it's not working. You got to tear it down. Do you push through that stuff, or do you kind of back away from it, work on something else, put it down for a second? What's your process in those moments?
It really depends, because sometimes I'm stuck just because I can't figure out some piece of the plot, or there's something about the story that I need to do more research on this. I don't know what I'm talking about. And so in those cases, I might jump ahead to a different part and write from there, or I might pause and do some re-outlining and try and figure it out before I jump back into it. And sometimes it's just because the story is not quite ready. I'm not feeling it yet, and there's something else that I want to work on instead. Or maybe it's a me thing. Like maybe I'm just overworked or tired or stressed about something else, or, it's the holidays, or I don't know, I've been traveling and the motivation isn't there, in which case that's a different solution, right? Maybe it is taking a step back and working on something else for a while. So it sort of depends on the situation. And I try to be flexible about taking time away from the project when it needs time, but also being disciplined and not letting myself off the hook too much. And I'm not feeling it today, so I'm just gonna, I don't know, play video games or whatever instead of writing. So it's tough. I think every writer sort of has to do their own little evaluation of what's wrong with the project or with them when something's just not quite working out. And you'll hear people say oh, I don't believe in writer's block, but I think writer's block is more the symptom, and then you have to sort of analyze well, what's the disease that's underneath that. The irony, and I think that a lot of writers face is we got into writing because we love books, we love reading. And then as a result of being an author, you have no time to actually read anymore. It's you're busy writing your own books. Yeah. And sometimes at the end of the day of writing my own stuff, I'm like, I don't want to look at words anymore. And
Totally.
then on top of that, I get sent books, right? So
Mm.
as authors, we get arcs and stuff that we're reading because we're going to be on a panel with some other author or do an event with another author that we're asked to blurb stuff. So yeah, it's constant struggle.
Reading Greenbone, you do such a good job at not only like subverting expectations and things like that, but you're taking these characters that I think I know, and you put them in these situations that I'm not expecting, and then they act in a way that I'm not expecting but can relate to. And it's like to juggle all of that, to juggle so much, not just capital P plot. This is what's happening. This is what's happening, but giving these characters this extra human emotion in these situations off the page. Like I feel like Hilo is sitting in his office stressing out while Shay is sitting in her office stressing out, and Andon is stressing out, and I can picture them all doing it because of these situations that you've laid out. They're so tangled together, but also so cohesive. How mangled everything kind of seems while you're reading it, and how much sense it makes once you're through it. And I'm wondering, like, while you're doing that, when you're drafting this kind of stuff, are you outlining all this, or are you kind of watching? Are you kind of like having a situation happen and then watching what the characters, like how they respond to it? I hope that wasn't too
Both.
complicated of a question. So,
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying because there were definitely times writing this trilogy I felt like it was going to break my brain because there were just so many pieces.
yeah.
And I would be like, okay, I know I have to take like these 6 threads and like connect them, and they have to all get braided together, and like 5 different things have to happen in the scene. So there were definitely times it felt like I was just one of those unicyclists, juggling like 12 plates in the air. And the question of like, well, okay, so how like tactically do you actually do that is sort of baffling because I can only kind of understand it in hindsight. And there was definitely some component that was planning, but then there was another component that was just like organically figuring it out as you go along. And the planning part for me comes down to kind of like knowing what the core of the story is and where it's going. So this could have been one of those stories that just veered off into ginormous scope creep, right? Like I could have had a whole other plot line happen in like Deppenland. I could have had, a whole other book happen about the mountain clan. Like it could have gone,
Off the rails.
off the rails. But in order to kind of keep the focus on it, I knew from the start that like this was sort of at its heart, it's a family saga, and it's about the Cull family. And so all of my narrative decisions had to be filtered through that. And I knew where I wanted this family to end up in the end. And so that like kept the wheels on the track. But then with all the like pieces and the things that had to be incorporated, some of them I would figure out ahead of time, but a lot of them actually just happen because of the tracks that get laid during the writing process. So like I would, for example, I'd have a scene and I would have some of the secondary characters in the clan show up in this scene. And then what happens as a result of having like this large cast of characters in this whole world is that like it makes sense for them to just keep coming back. So like, for example, have characters that are kind of minor characters in the first book. Like I would have I think like the first time Vin shows up, he's like a minor character who, has really good perception. Okay, by the time I get to the third book, there's like an opportunity for like these characters that have already been created to show up at like opportune times and do cool things. So you're almost like farming your own work and finding like things you've already done that suddenly intuitively make sense for you to pick up and use. The layers kind of grow naturally on top of each other.
It's like a tool belt.
Yeah.
You maybe forgot, oh, I have the perfect tool for this situation. One of the things I found so refreshing about Greenbone I read quite a bit of high fantasy. That's my genre. That's what I make all this content around. Your incorporation of modern technology into what could rightly be labeled high fantasy, secondary worlds, I mean, did that come about as a response to more medieval Western European settings that are very prevalent and popular in fantasy? Was that something that you had noticed that you actively and like mentally like wanted to do differently, or did it just feel kind of natural for the setting you were writing?
Yeah, it was very much the latter. I mean, I, of course, have read plenty of medieval milieu fantasy, but the Green Bone Saga wasn't really a active subversion of that. I wasn't like, oh, I'm really tired of this. Oh, I want to write a fantasy that's completely different. It just kind of worked out that way because I wanted to take a bunch of stuff that I enjoyed and sort of smash it all together. And so, like the inspirations for the Green Bone Saga included the wuxia genre, kung fu flicks, mob movies, both like
Mm-hmm.
Western cinema and Eastern cinema, gangster media. And so I like kind of just smashed all that together. And then, of course, epic fantasy. Right? And so it just turned out that like the vibe that I wanted to create and the sort of vision that I had in my head wasn't something that was like common in epic fantasy and high fantasy. And I like, I mean, what's a gangster saga without dark alleyways and men smoking and Tommy guns and all
Yeah.
that. So it was just like natural. That was the picture that I had scrolling through my head as I was writing the Green Bone Saga and trying to like make all these pieces work together was really kind of the aim of that. I wasn't trying to like kind of do the opposite of epic fantasy. I was trying to bring epic fantasy into other things that I loved.
I love that. That's really cool. Yeah, I mean, having these kind of crime family type situations, I mean, like it almost calls for like shady phone calls and quick plane
Exactly.
rides and, someone sitting in the back of a car that might blow up or something. Like that's yes.
Right.
Yeah, we need that stuff. And you introducing the more kind of conventional high fantasy element of like this, I guess you could call, for lack of a better word, magical substance that
Right.
is very important. So your marrying of those two things, I'm honestly shocked nobody had thought of it yet. Like it's now, like after reading it, it's like, oh, it's so obvious. It's such a good idea.
Well, I mean, they say writers write, what they want to read. So
Totally. Yeah.
that was what I wanted, and I didn't have it on hand, so I guess I had to write a bunch of books.
Would you consider Greenbone to be urban fantasy? Like because I've seen that term like floated around for it, and I think like
Yeah,
it doesn't really strike. Like yes, there's buildings and
right,
streets and stuff, but I never really got the urban vibe from it. And I was just
right.
curious what you thought about that.
I didn't think of it as really any specific genre when I was writing it,
Yeah.
which goes to show that I did not think super deeply about marketability. and, and so like
Whatever.
I heard it described as urban fantasy only after it was published.
Hmm.
But I did not think of it as urban fantasy because in my mind, urban fantasy had like very specific conventions
Right.
that had come to be associated with it, and I think those are rather limiting conventions. I think urban fantasy should be considered more broadly, and I'm actually fine with people holding up my book as an example of a different type of urban fantasy.
Hmm.
But at the time that I was writing Green Bone Saga, urban fantasy was very synonymous with like paranormal and like set in our world, but with
Right.
hidden magic creatures like werewolves and vampires. And so that wasn't what I was writing, obviously. So I didn't think of it as urban fantasy in that way. I definitely thought of it more as an epic fantasy story, but set in modern times. But now I've heard people call it, epic urban fantasy or, modern epic fantasy, which is like whatever you want to call it. That's fine with me.
So Jade Legacy, the final Greenbone installment, the longest one, I'm pretty sure, was released fairly recently. What was it like saying goodbye to that world? I mean, I know that you've done some kind of more peripheral, kind of shorter stuff on the side and things like that, but ultimately you're closing that chapter on that story and that family. What was it like after so many years and so much work and revisions and everything that you had to do to finish it?
It was weird. I'm not gonna
Yeah.
lie, it felt very bittersweet.
Hmm.
On one hand, there was this overwhelming sense of relief, like, oh, thank God, it actually got done. And you have to remember, I wrote Jade Legacy largely during 2020.
Yeah.
So it was my pandemic book. And it was this weird experience of, wow, like everything just going to pieces in the world around me, but like just putting my head down and being super determined to finish this trilogy. There was this relief of just finishing the project, but then also just this. It was sad.
Yeah.
It was hard to leave that world and all those characters, which is why I ended up writing a novella and a bunch of short stories because I couldn't quite let go. I was like,
Yeah.
I knew I was not going to write, a whole other book, but I just wanted to hang out with those characters for a little bit longer and
Yeah.
maybe see them as they were way back at the beginning and remind myself of, those characters
Oh.
before I put them through all the trauma that I put them through.
The absolute
So
hell.
so there was a lot of mixed feelings about it. And we talked about Untethered Sky and coming back to a previous project. That was largely because I mentioned, I needed to do something different. But also I wanted to go back to something that I felt like I had already gotten a little bit of momentum on, because it was hard to pull myself out of the Green Bone Saga world, even though I had all these other projects I wanted to do, and I was excited to work on them. It still felt like, but what I don't know these other people. Like, where's my family? I know the Call family.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was definitely, it was happy, and it was also, it was hard.
I mean, it makes sense because, like, I mean, I had a huge hangover after those books, and I had only gone through it. It took me, like 3 or 4 weeks, something like that. But you were working on it for years. You had been through
Yeah.
everything. Yeah, it's such a more intense process for you. So yeah, thank you for answering that one. Okay, so I have a question, and I've interviewed a lot of authors on here, and this is always a touchy one. So, but I understand why it's touchy. But are you able to speak on the Green Bone Saga television adaptation in any capacity? Just like one word, 10 words.
It's in progress, I guess. It's alive. Yeah, I mean,
It's
it's been
alive.
through some ups and downs in Hollywood.
Mm,
I think a lot of authors can relate to how unpredictable things get, with film and television options. Probably most people who've been following, me on social media know that it was optioned to Peacock, and they decided to shelve it and not go ahead with it. So that option expired, and then we have since re-optioned it. But that is not public yet because it's still in the process of, forming creative team, and still have early stages. So I'm hoping we'll be in a place where I can talk a little bit more about where it's going to go from here. But I guess the short answer is, there's still hope and potential for it, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed like everyone else.
what do you imagine it's going to feel like if they when they I'm going to say when they make this show, and you've got all these events that you had written down on your computer on screen with a budget and actors and lighting and music and all that? Like, are you worried about maybe your baby being changed, or because I imagine, as you can see by, like, I don't know, Game of Thrones,
Yeah.
like, authors don't have a ton of control of like what these studios are doing. Do you feel any kind of like trepidation at putting that control in other people's hands, seeing what they do with it, seeing what they don't do with it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you don't know, right? You don't have
Yeah.
control over it. And you might end up loving it. You might end up absolutely hating it. I think regardless, it'll be cool.
Yeah.
But also, I think as an author, it's important to kind of emotionally distance yourself. Some authors are super involved, like they want to be part of the writer's room and to be writing the scripts. But Like I'm a novelist. If I wanted to be a screenwriter, I'd be a screenwriter. So I have books to write. And for me, the books will always be there. The books will always be my vision. They're exactly like every word in those books is intentional. So the Green Bone Saga is what I want it to be. And if someone else takes it as a jumping off point and turns it into a show or something else, a movie or some other form of entertainment, that's cool. I'm glad that it inspired that. And I would love to see these characters on screen just like everyone else. But I also have to kind of harden my heart a little bit. And I think like a lot of authors have to do that, or like you have to also understand that it's like, it's not your thing. It sort of is, but it's also not.
I asked this one on almost all of my author interviews, but I really like this question. Do you have any advice for aspiring authors? Is there anything with regard to the writing process that you had to learn the hard way?
That's a really great question. I am thinking back on, before I was published, and I don't think I fully appreciated just how much work it was to be an author. Like you sort of think, oh, you're an author, like most of your time is spent writing. Like that's like sort of the obvious conclusion to come to. But once you're published, like there's a ton of other obligations that come with this job, and including things like promoting your books, being like online, social media, maintaining a website, like running giveaways, doing events, talking to people, going to cons. Like there's a lot of stuff that is part of this job, and they're fun oftentimes, but you also just will struggle to preserve your creative time, and it's something that certainly I know that I have to do. I have to make this very, very deliberate effort to always like protect my writing time. And I think a lot of authors find themselves in that situation too. The other thing that I think I didn't really understand at the beginning and appreciate is the fact that like it doesn't get any easier. I remember thinking like, oh, if I like write this, once I've written the first book, like I'll know how to write a book. It'll be easier the second time around. And surely by the time I've written like 5 or 6 books, I'll know how to do this. It's like riding a bike, surely, right? But like it's not any easier. It doesn't get any faster. Every single book is challenging. Every single book, I'm like, I don't know how to write. I'm like Googling how to write a novel. And I'm at this point, like I'm working on like my ninth. Is this my ninth? My ninth book. Actually, my ninth and 10th books. And yeah, I'm like, I don't know how to do this. Every time I go through this, I'm like, I don't know how to write. And I'll look back on books I've written and I'll be like, who wrote this? It's pretty good. So I know that's highly discouraging to some of you who may be listening. I'm very sorry if it is, but just take comfort, I guess, from the fact that like it continues to be challenging because every book is different. Every book goes through its own process. You might be in a different place as a person, as a writer. You're trying to do different things. If you are pushing yourself, it should still be hard because, every project I've done, I'm trying to do something different. And so, yeah, it's kind of horrible, but it's also kind of great.
That makes a lot of sense. This is going to be my last question, and then we can go ahead and wrap up. What would you like as a reader and a writer, a lover of fantasy, of fiction, genre fiction, all kinds of things like that? What would you like to see more of in the fantasy genre today?
That's a really good question. I think the fantasy genre has broadened a lot, just even in the time that I have been published and working. It's changed for the better in so many ways. And it's a great time to be reading fantasy, honestly. Like if you're someone who's listening and like maybe you liked fantasy when you were younger, but you kind of stopped reading fantasy, I mean, now's the time to get back in. Like now, fantasies is just so much to offer. And it's certainly no longer just like swords and sorcery in a D&D style world, right? There's so much more variety. In terms of like what else I would like to see though, I would like to see like all the trends that have happened in terms of broadening the types of stories and voices continue. But I'd also like to see fantasy be more inventive, which is kind of a strange thing to say considering that it's fantasy, right?
It's like
it should be the most inventive, imaginative genre that there is. But sometimes I think that sometimes science fiction is sort of the other side of the speculative coin that takes more risks. And fantasy sometimes I think can kind of be comfortable in that it has all these sort of tropes and conventions that people are familiar with and they just accept, a dragon is a dragon is a dragon, kind of, almost, there's these shorthands in fantasy that that are cool and comforting, as a reader sometimes, but that can kind of make it expected as well sometimes. So I'd like to see, fantasy just be more daring, I guess, take more risks, especially because cross-genre fiction is so much easier to accomplish these days and more accepted, and there's just more appetite for it, I think. I'd love to see, I don't know, a fantasy spy thriller set in the Cold War, there's you mentioned Travis Baldree, right? His book Legends and Lattes blew up because it took those old conventions and was let's just make this cozy slice of life. I mean, that was a really inventive thing to do. So I think as someone working in the field, it's awesome to be part of this renaissance of the genre. I just hope it continues and we keep doing things that are cool and daring and sort of ask hard questions, and sort of push the boundaries as much as we can.
Yeah, part of what I do is listen to a lot of my fans and followers and stuff ask me for recommendations on, and mostly they're genre pointed, right? People are asking, can you give me a recommendation for this kind of genre or this kind of genre? And I've noticed they seem to be getting more specific. So people are saying, I want fantasy horror. And it's I don't really know about that much of that. I mean, there's fantasy with spooky elements to it, but there's not a lot of true, really horrific stories that are set in a fantasy world. I mean, maybe Between Two Fires or Perdido Street Station or the kind of stuff that's in that vein, but nothing where I've seen an abundance of fantasy conventions mixed with an abundance of horror conventions and things like that. So I totally agree with you. Yeah, taking some risks, and there is a certain, and I think that Travis Baldree maybe capitalized on that a little bit, is there's a certain coziness to it that I feel everybody really wants to come home to with fantasy. You want to get that feeling of sinking into it, something else again. And, we're all chasing that for sure. But there is something to be said of pushing those boundaries of convention out so that we can then explore not only new worlds, but characters interacting with their realities in those new worlds, which makes for deeper characters and deeper situations too. And I think that you did a really excellent job with that in Green Bone, and I think that that's why that trilogy exploded the way that it did, is because you married those two things so well. They're such fantastic books. I'm so happy to have read them. I'm definitely going to reread them for sure, because I need to get back in there. I want to hang out with Hilo and Lan and Shay and everybody. And everybody that's listening right now, Fonda and I talked quite a bit about Green Bone, but we also talked about Untethered Sky, her new novella that's coming out. That is coming out on April 11th, and you can buy it for yourself and probably read it really fast, because I read it in one day because I couldn't put it down. It was so excellent. Fonda, I really appreciate you coming on to Book Reviews Kill and talking with me. I've been looking forward to this for a really long time, and I had really been hoping for this since I had read the Green Bone Saga.
No, it's been a pleasure chatting with you, Evan. Thanks for having me on the show.
Of course. And everybody listening, you can find Fonda Lee on social media in the description on this episode. Everybody, thank you so much for listening. I hope you all have an awesome rest of your day, and of course, happy reading.